and welcome to episode 10 of Creative Adventures, an accidental podcast. Thank you for joining me, and thanks for all of the lovely messages and reviews and shares. It's very much appreciated. And also thank you for the many messages reminding me to switch my fridge and my boiler back on after I've finished recording. They really do help. I haven't forgotten again to switch the fridge back on since the first time I did it. And it's warmed up quite a bit now. It's getting towards the end of March, so the boiler isn't on. But yeah, I appreciate those messages as well. And I didn't make it through February and March without the February and March brain diary glitch that I mentioned at the end of the last podcast. And that's the thing that gets me every year, and I don't know why. Well, not every year. It doesn't happen on a leap year. But every year I end up messing my diary and confusing dates in February and March, simply because the days and the dates are the same. So if the 13th of February is a Friday, the 13th of March would be a Friday as well. And it doesn't happen in any other month. It doesn't happen when there's a leap year in February. And it shouldn't make any difference. But every year I end up getting a date wrong or scheduling something wrong. And this year was the most spectacular mess up. I thought, seeing as I'd mentioned it on the podcast and I've told everyone about it, I'm not going to do it this year. And I'd arranged to meet a friend in central London. And I think I was meeting him at like 11 o'clock or something. And I suddenly realised the time and that I should have left at least an hour ago. So I was going to be at least 30 minutes late. And I hate being late. I'm early to everything. So being late is a real panic state for me. So I ran as fast as I could and jumped on the first train and ran to the venue. And I was sending him messages saying, I'm really sorry, I'm going to be really late. And I didn't hear back. And as I was running to the venue, I got a message from him saying, Steve, we're not meeting till March. And I realised I had run and sweated and managed to be late for a meeting and a coffee that was actually a month early. And I can laugh about it now, but at the time I just thought, why does this keep happening? And what was even more annoying is I'd arranged some stuff later on in the day because I was going to be in central London anyway. And then I just had most of the day with nothing to do, which it really isn't a massive problem in the grand scheme of things, but it completely threw me and really made me fed up. So I'm glad that's out of the way for another year. I don't know when the next leap year is. I don't think it's for another couple of years. So who knows, this time next year, it might have gone even more spectacularly wrong. And it's also hard to believe that this is episode 10. It seems like I only started this thing a little while ago. And I decided a few months back that I didn't want to do anything special to mark episode 10. For a while I thought, I could do something different as it's the 10th episode. Maybe I could ask listeners what they'd like in it, or speak about what it's been like to record the 10 episodes of the podcast. But as soon as I had those ideas, I thought they were rubbish. I thought they were way too obvious, like the obvious thing to do. And I don't mean obvious in the sense of how Keith Johnson used to talk about obvious. Keith used to say obvious was really just the expression of uncensored, spontaneous thoughts. I mean, more of the obvious thing, like, that's what common sense says, like, make it a celebration. And I got a bit annoyed with myself for even feeling that episode 10 was significant. I mean, it's just another number, and it's just another episode that I'm doing because I love getting lost in this process of following chains of thought and seeing where they end up, and then seeing who listens and seeing what resonates with you. And I started to wonder why the number 10 feels so significant anyway, and wanted to find out a bit more about this. Like, why is this progression from single digits to double digits? Why was I even thinking of marking it? Why didn't I think of doing that for episode 7? And the most obvious explanation that I came across is that 10 feels important simply because by design, we have 10 fingers. Like, from the earliest days of human history, the number 10's probably felt meaningful even before we had language, because these important parts of our anatomy that enabled us to make tools and to hunt and to do all these important things, there were 10 of these little worm-like digits on the end of them. So 10 has been significant probably for a very, very long time. And then as language developed and concepts such as maths and science emerged, the number 10 took on even more significance. The Pythagoreans believed that 10 was the most perfect number, and they revered a geometric shape called a tetractys, which is an arrangement of the first four numbers, so 1, 2, 3, 4, in rows that not only adds up to 10, which blew my mind. 1, 2, 3, 4 adds up to 10. If maths was taught to me in school like this, like patterns and art, I think I would have done a lot better. But the tetractys is the first four digits arranged in rows that not only add up to 10, but make a really cool triangle pyramid shape. And the Pythagoreans loved this idea so much that they started to believe that the number 10 in the tetractys contained the entire structure of reality and represented proportional balance and like the rules of reality and the rules of art and music and all of that sort of stuff. And basically, the number 10 contained the hidden structures of the cosmos, which, to be fair, is as good as any other theory that I've heard as to what on earth is this reality that we're experiencing. And as society's evolved, so has our interest in this significance of 10. And I came across a 2014 scientific paper that suggests that existential reflection increases for humans near decade boundaries of age. Sort of like at 19, 29, 39, 49. And whilst the process of aging and experiencing time is continuous, it's not fragmented in that way, we sort of have a cognitive experience of approaching a new decade as approaching a boundary that I guess we treat like the ending of a chapter and the starting of a new one. And the paper just said that these moments, like these nines at the end of a decade, prompt a moment of life evaluation. Or, to adopt a more modern metaphor, the number 9 is like an ender-level boss in a computer game that we've got to work out how to defeat or get past before we can get to the next level. A threshold guardian is an archetype that's appeared in human storytelling right from the dawn of time. And we find these threshold guardians in folklores and myths and legends, and more recently in books and stories and films. And in storytelling terms, a threshold guardian is a being or an obstacle that stands between the hero or the protagonist's current reality and whatever lies beyond. And often the threshold guardian tests the hero's resolve and readiness for the next stage of the adventure, like forcing them to overcome obstacles they haven't before, or dig deeper or be braver than they have before in order to progress. And we can find examples of these threshold guardians in most stories. Like in Greek mythology, the three-headed dog Cerberus guards the entrance to the underworld and stops the living from getting in there and the dead from leaving. And in many folk tales and children's story, a troll or a gremlin guards a bridge and demands a toll or sets a challenge before you can cross it. And in one of the most memorable scenes in the Lord of the Rings films, the Balrog blocks the hero's escape from Moira across the bridge of Khazad-dûm. I have no idea if I've pronounced that right. I don't understand whatever language Lord of the Rings stuff's in. And I like the idea that the progression from 9 to 10, be that age or podcast episodes, it feels significant and worthy of ceremony or celebration because at some level we experience it as facing and overcoming a temporal threshold guardian. Like episode 9, I had to conquer and defeat, and now episode 10 is this whole new world, whereas in reality, it's absolutely no different. But that idea of crossing that threshold, we find ourselves in a new realm of experience where possibilities are greater, maybe. So I've come to the conclusion that that's maybe why I couldn't help thinking about marking the occasion of episode 10, even though I thought it was a stupid idea to do it. But it led me down this rabbit hole of trying to work out why 10 was significant anyway, which I now realise has meant that I have marked episode 10 accidentally by going down that rabbit hole. And February saw the 3-year anniversary of me moving into my flat. And I don't normally pay attention to anniversaries like that, but this one always feels significant because moving into this flat where I record this podcast was marking the end of an exciting but rather turbulent year that I'd spent house sitting, which was great. I lived in a number of different places rent-free for a while, but it was also quite unstable that I could be told that I couldn't live there anymore at like a week or 2 weeks notice, and then have to find somewhere else to go. So finally finding a stable base, even though I had to start paying rent, it felt like a much needed change that really helped my mental and physical health at the time. But the anniversary of moving into this flat also feels significant because it's inextricably linked with a bizarre dreamlike experience of living on a remote island for the month of January. And the island adventure began when my American friend Jim sent me an email saying, "How is your housing situation? I have an idea for you if you're looking for something in January. It would be a very unique experience." And I'd originally met Jim 10 years earlier at a strange creative experiment in the mountains of Spain. And I'd reunited with him at the same event in the summer of 2022. And we got to know each other a lot more during that week for a number of weird experiences, including getting lost in the Spanish summer heat and accidentally coming face to face with a wild boar. And I think that was the moment that cemented our friendship. And we kept in touch regularly after this, so when I told Jim that I was running out of house-sitting properties, he was keen to help. And when I initially read Jim's email, I thought that maybe he had like a quirky flat in London or a remote cabin in the forest of Scotland. But when he told me the property was on Ocracoke Island, the first thing I did was get onto Google Maps and find out where on earth is Ocracoke Island. And when the map loaded, I saw this strange-looking long sliver of land about 30 miles off the coast of North Carolina, and I just thought, there's no way I can go and live there for a month. I've been living in places like Camden and London Bridge. Ocracoke Island is a bit extreme for me. But part of me was so intrigued, and I did a bit more research and discovered that the island is a nature reserve. It's got a 26-kilometre sandy beach, like uninterrupted 26-kilometre sandy beach. And it's virtually deserted in the month of January. But the thing that really sealed the deal for me was finding out that Ocracoke Island is home to the Atlantic ghost crab. Like those amazing crabs with the eyes that stick up on stalks at the top of their head. So I accepted Jim's kind invitation and said, how about we make it an art residency? We'll call it the Ocracoke Art Adventure and make it an official art residency. And Jim liked this and built on the suggestion and said, yeah, the art could be inspired by the places, people and creatures of the island. And Jim told me about the famous ochre cats, which is such a brilliant word, but it's basically just these cats that live on Ocracoke that have been given this name ochre cats. And immediately what came to mind when Jim said that is that fellow artist J.D. Wolf could come along, as she's known for painting these brilliant animal portraits, including cats. So Jim agreed, and as the date for setting off to the island approached, Joe and I invited patrons to try and raise money to buy art materials, and many people generously obliged. So finally, on the 8th of January 2023, I boarded a flight at Heathrow, flew to New York, got a connecting flight to Wilmington, where I met Jim and his wife Laura. And then from there we drove 3 hours through rural North Carolina to the remote ferry terminal at Cedar Island. And then after this 3-hour amazing crossing on the ferry across Pamlico Sound, where you could see no land at all, there's literally just sea all around, I finally arrived on Ocracoke Island. And then all of a sudden the adventure became really real. It was that moment when theory becomes reality. And it was like, oh, this is actually happening now. And Joe wasn't arriving to join me for another 10 days. So when Jim and Laura left, I found myself totally alone and very quickly started to think that this whole thing was a terrible mistake. There's no holiday makers and only a few residents on the island in the depths of January. And even though a handful of people were in the main town, the house I was staying in was some way from it. And my aloneness very quickly turned into loneliness, like a despairing feeling where I felt down but also had no desire or motivation to make any art. And what made this feeling worse was that I had £750 worth of art materials on the table that our generous patrons had paid for. And it started to feel like the art suppliers were mocking me, saying, come on, you're supposed to be an artist. Be productive and make some art. These people have paid for these materials. Don't let them down. And when I woke up the next morning, I felt really down and really lost and really lonely. And I know from past experiences that when I feel these kind of feelings, trying to fight them or change them or resist them only makes them worse. And I've learned that the best thing that I can do is to move towards them, to try and be curious about them. So I decided I needed to feel even more lost and even more lonely, and headed off on my weird bike to the remotest part of the beach, knowing it would be the furthest away from human beings that I could be. And when I got there, the beach was totally deserted, and my only company was the crashing sound of the winter waves and the occasional passing pelican or dolphin. So I hid my bike behind a sand dune, which was ridiculous really, because who's going to steal it? No one's there. Maybe a bunch of ghost crabs would take it. But it's habit, I guess, of living in London. And I just went for a walk by the sea, feeling the winter cold and trying to stay close to these feelings that I was feeling. And after a while, I came across a bit of driftwood and thought, that might be a nice thing to paint. I had my rucksack with me and just some black and white paints in my bag. And then a little bit further on, I found a tree trunk, like a slim tree trunk. So I took that with the driftwood to a sheltered place in the sand dunes, because it was really windy, where I could just sit and paint. And I really wanted to honour how I was feeling, so I just painted the words, "I need to be alone," on the driftwood. And then I nailed it onto the tree trunk that I'd also decorated with some little black and white shapes and creatures. And when I stood back and looked at it, I realised that I'd created something like a totem of aloneness, a celebration of the experience of being alone. And it made me feel a little bit better. I'd sort of lost myself in the process of making for it a bit and wasn't conscious of this weird experience that I was in. So I dug a hole and planted the totem in the middle of the beach and went off to try and remember which sand dune I'd hidden my bike behind. And I got to know the island a bit better over the following few days, and I discovered that there was a bar that was open for a few hours each evening, a bar called Zilly's. And as it was the only place to go in the evenings, I decided to give it a visit. And of course, as soon as I opened my mouth to order a drink, the handful of locals heard my accent and said, "What are you doing on Ocracoke in January?" So I told them I was an artist and I was doing an art residency and I was going to be here for the whole month. And then one of the locals looked at me and paused and said in a really serious sounding tone, "Are you the one that left that thing on the beach?" And my immediate thought was that I'd done something terribly wrong. Ocracoke's a nature reserve, and maybe this totem of aloneness thing was illegal or offensive, and I was already feeling alone and disconnected, and I didn't want to make enemies on my third day of a month's residency. But I reluctantly admitted that I made it, and was surprised when the guy turned to the other people in the bar and said, "Hey, this is the guy that made the thing on the beach." And then he turned to me and said, "This is all over the Ocracoke Facebook group. We love it." And from that point on, everything changed. I got to know the locals in Zilly's, and they got to know me as the British artist who made things out of driftwood. And because it's a small island and hardly anyone's there, I'd bump into people at the bar in the various jobs that they had. And some people would work in the shop and work in the bar, and you'd see them in a restaurant as well. So I started to get to know more and more people. And I decided to let go of the need to use any of the art materials that people had bought. And I simply visited the beach each day with my black and white paint to see what the sea had washed up for me to work with. And some days there was nothing, which I took as a sign to take a day off. But other days there were huge pieces of wood that would take me almost an entire day to decorate. And I'd lose myself in the process and be out in nature and then install it somewhere that was hidden enough to not distract from the beauty of the island, but prominent enough that it would provoke curiosity and wonder in people. I even found an old cigar box that I turned into a geocache-style treasure chest that I buried on the beach with some secret coordinates that I painted on another bit of driftwood to show where it was. And when Joe arrived on the island, we continued to make all sorts of art from the things that we found, and that connected us to even more locals. We ended up meeting one of the presenters from Ocracoke Community Radio who invited us to do a radio show with him, which was great fun. And on the back of that, we met a journalist who wrote a 2-page article about us for the Ocracoke Observer newspaper. And I started to feel like part of the community. One day we cycled to see the famous Ocracoke ponies, which the legend of the Ocracoke ponies is they have been there for hundreds of years because they were on a shipwreck and the ship sunk and they swam to Ocracoke. And we cycled up there to see them, but I got a flat tyre on the way and didn't have a pump or anything. And it was miles, absolutely miles. So I was just going to have to walk my bike back. And as I was pushing my bike back, and Joe's bike was working, but she was walking alongside me pushing it, someone pulled up and offered us a lift, and we squeezed into the back of this tiny Mini with our bikes. And the person said, "Oh, are you the British artists on the island?" Which was lovely, that the things that we were doing were connecting us and helping us become part of the community. And then on the 31st of January, we left Ocracoke and started the ridiculously long journey back. And straight away, the whole experience of the last month started to feel like a strange dream. And when I got back, I'd run out of house-sitting properties, so I moved straight into this flat and started to reflect on what that last month on Ocracoke had been about. And what I kept coming back to was the experience of that initial day on the beach and making the totem of aloneness. And it struck me that by moving towards the thing I was trying to get away from, like feeling lost and lonely and disconnected, I had actually discovered company and connection in spontaneous and organic ways that were far more exciting than if I'd asked Jim to make some introductions in advance of getting there. And I'm really fascinated by the difference between aloneness and loneliness. I've got a real need for self-regulating alone time, but I know that very suddenly this can tip into feeling lonely, and I've never understood what causes this shift. There's a lot of psychological theories that suggest that loneliness evolved in humans as a warning signal, like an indication that our social needs aren't being met and prompting us to change our behaviour, in a similar way like hunger motivates us to seek food. And more recently, some neuroscientists have suggested that loneliness may just be a form of psychological hunger, a real biological signal similar to hunger or thirst that motivates us to seek connection for our survival. But while I like that concept, I still don't fully understand what it is that satisfies this psychological hunger when I can be sitting in exactly the same room on different days, and one day it feels like I'm peacefully alone, and another day it can feel I'm painfully connection-starved. I came across a research paper that I'll put a link to if you want to in the podcast notes by two researchers called Perlman and Peplau. And they defined loneliness as the gap between the social connection that we want and the connection we feel we have, which is obvious at one level, but also makes utter sense. So in other words, when loneliness is voluntary, it can result in an experience of calm and self-regulating solitude. But when it feels imposed or unwanted, it can mutate into dysregulating loneliness. And reading about solitude reminded me of Hannah Arendt's work on loneliness. And she makes a specific distinction between solitude and loneliness. And for her, solitude is being two in one with oneself, which means that we can be alone, like physically alone, not around humans, but we're still in some deep connection and dialogue with our inner experience. And by dialogue, I mean words, but also beyond words. We can be in dialogue and connected with ourselves beyond words through feelings and sensations, as well as thoughts and language. And Hannah Arendt goes on to suggest that loneliness results from the loss of that internal dialogue and that connection with ourselves. So that means that regardless of whether we're physically alone or not, that disconnection and loss of our two-in-one state with ourselves results in a sense of emptiness or alienation where we feel we don't belong anywhere, not even in ourselves. And that can happen whether we are physically around people or not. But the bit that really excites me about Hannah Arendt's work is the paradoxical nature of it all. That intentionally practicing solitude can actually protect against loneliness. And this helps me make sense of my early Ocracoke experience, even though I didn't know that this was what I was doing. But by moving into that empty, desolate landscape where there weren't any other humans, I entered a space where aloneness was just the conditions of the environment. And it transformed it from maybe a sense of loneliness into an experience of solitude. And then finding the driftwood and becoming immersed in making that totem of aloneness maybe restored that two-in-one relationship with myself. The process of making the art was like a kind of non-verbal dialogue where I was noticing and paying attention to how I was feeling and responding to it. And that ended up with a physical artifact. And then the bit I loved was this physical artifact that came from moving towards solitude became a social bridge between me and the sparse Ocracoke community who decided to remain on the island in January. And realizing all of this really helps me because I guess I don't need to be on a remote beach miles away, 3 hours off the coast of North Carolina to do that. But that idea of moving towards solitude and finding peace in that and how that can then result in connection feels like a wonderful thing to do if I can carry on doing it. And I think that's the most reflecting that I've done on the Ocracoke experience, to be honest. I still don't completely understand what went on or what it was all about. And I don't really need to. Oh, and in case you're wondering, the art materials that we didn't end up using, the art materials that were mocking me, we donated all of those to the local school. So they got used. They went to a good home. The patrons' generosity was rewarded in a different way. And then the other thing is I didn't get to see any crabs. That was one of my main reasons for going, was to finally see an Atlantic ghost crab. But I think it was just too cold for them. They don't hang out in January. As you know from previous episodes, crabs are one of my creaturely obsessions. And any opportunity to hang out with them or see a new species is always something that fascinates me. But I read about another creature recently that I don't know if I ever saw in my scuba diving days, but I became really interested in it. And it's called an amphioxus, and it's a tiny, translucent little sea creature that lives on a sandy seabed. And it burrows down into the sand and only the top end of its body sticks out, and it filter feeds. So as the water flows through its gills, it extracts plankton, and that's how it lives. And fossil evidence shows that amphioxus-like creatures have existed in this same way for over 500 million years, and their form has changed very little. So it's a really simple design of a creature, but in evolutionary terms, it's amazing. It's not really changed. And I first learnt about amphioxus from the book 7.5 Lessons About the Brain by Lisa Feldman Barrett. It's a book that I really enjoyed. I'm really slow at reading, but I ended up reading this in almost 3 days. In fact, it was the book that I had in my bag. I didn't have my laptop or anything on that mess up of my diary that I mentioned at the start. And so I just spent hours and hours reading this book. But Lisa Feldman Barrett is a neuroscientist and psychologist, and what I love is her work challenges many traditional assumptions about how the human brain works. And she begins the book by introducing the amphioxus as a distant relative of ours, because we had a common ancestor that lived during the Cambrian period. But while amphioxus kept this original body plan, other animals that eventually turned into vertebrates evolved much more complex bodies and systems. So over this period of millions of years, amphioxus essentially remained a translucent stomach on a stick, as Feldman Barrett calls it. But these new creatures needed these systems to support a more complex existence, like a cardiovascular system to pump blood and a respiratory system to take in oxygen, as well as hormone systems and waste management systems, and then muscle systems to balance and move and coordinate a much more complex body. And Feldman Barrett uses this evolutionary process and comparing the amphioxus to us to challenge dominant beliefs about our brain's primary function. And she suggests that the brain's job isn't thinking. It's simply running a little worm body that has become very, very complicated. And in this view, the main function of the brain is allostasis, the process of continual change where an organism adjusts its internal state and its internal functions to maintain stability and safety. So Feldman Barrett suggests that the brain's main role is to simply manage resources. It's not about wonderful logic or problem solving or anything else. It's managing resources. It's managing these complex systems that we have. Our respiration, our blood pumping, coordinating our muscles simply to keep us alive. And she compares it to a complex financial investment firm with a number of different departments that are dedicated to different functions. And their job is to invest energy in the hope of earning a good return in terms of food, affection, and protection. I get excited by anything that challenges dominant narratives, but especially when it's about how we perceive ourselves as a species. And whilst I'm interested in neuroscience, I've always thought it's fundamentally flawed, because it's a field in which human brains are studying human brains, using equipment created by human brains, and a scientific method to interpret those data that's been collectively agreed as robust and valid by human brains. And it all feels a little bit biased to me. If we're a different species doing all of this, perhaps a frog or a badger, or maybe even a totally different life form from another planet, I'd be much more inclined to believe the findings were real and accurate. What really fascinates me about this 7.5 Lessons About the Brain book is it invites us to rethink the brain's role in terms of creativity. Her research shows that the triune brain model, like that of a lizard brain that then evolved a mammalian brain that then evolved a neocortex, this progression is fundamentally flawed. And this whole left brain, right brain theory is really oversimplified. And that if we let go of all of these flawed models, the brain begins to look less like a thinking machine, and more like a set of highly professional accounting departments managing resources to meet the body's needs. And I can't help wonder if that's why the brain's grey, because that's the dress code for all of the accountants that work in there. So I'm left wondering that maybe the brain has far less to do with creativity than we've been led to believe. Its role might simply be to resource us and budget our energy and ensure we have enough of a sense of safety to express our creative selves. The brain's a support function enabling something much more mysterious and exciting to arise from elsewhere within us. And this is exciting because it completely flips a dominant narrative that the brain and its tendency towards logical, linear and rational thought is the source of everything humanly brilliant. And the wonderfully weird, surreal comedian Emo Phillips sums up this shift much better than I've just rambled on about in a single sentence. Emo Phillips says, "I used to think that the brain was the most wonderful organ in my body. Then I realised who was telling me this." And that's a wonderful sentiment from a brilliant weirdo to end on, because we're up on time. So thank you for listening to episode 10. And I really appreciate your ears and your attention and your support of the podcast. I genuinely only do this for me because, as you can tell, I just end up going down these amazing, fascinating rabbit holes and then I record it. But when you do listen and when you do share and when other people hear it and then they write to me, even if it's just to remind me to switch my fridge on, I absolutely love it. So thank you for that. I'll put a link in the podcast notes to some workshops that I've got coming up. I've got a mask workshop, a musical improvisation workshop and a paper cutting workshop coming up, but I'll put links to those. But one thing I will highlight is I've got my first open studio of the year on the 18th of April, which is a Saturday, and it's part of Coppell Kingston's official open studios, which means that not only will my studio, Studio 2, be open, but lots of other studios in the building will be. So you don't need to book a ticket or anything, but if you want more information, just send me an email. Just come along on the 18th of January to Studio 2 at Coppell Kingston in Kingston upon Thames, and you can come and hang out in my brain for a bit. And I've got loads of art on the walls that you can have a look at. We'll probably make some badges or make some zines if you're into that stuff. I have my little pop-up shop. And then you can go and have a look around at all the other studios or have a wander down to the river in Kingston. Maybe you'll see my crows. You might see crow and lightning. I've noticed that they've started behaving a bit differently over the last few weeks. And I wonder if that's because it's getting towards nest egg time. I'm sure there's a more scientific term for that. But I remember last year this happened and they're sort of being a bit strange. They're hanging around more closely together. And I noticed the other day that Crow, when she normally eats the food out of my hand, she normally stashes it somewhere. So she'll store it in her goulard pouch and then go off and hide it in a hedgerow somewhere. But she started just eating it all now. So maybe she is feeding an egg. I don't know enough about crow biology. That's probably terribly wrong. But yeah, they are behaving differently. So you might get to see them. But whether you come to a workshop or my open studios or buy anything from my shop, I really appreciate you listening. The next podcast will be out sometime in April. I can't remember the date, but will be sometime in the middle of April. Episode 11. I won't mark that in any way whatsoever. But thank you for joining me. I look forward to seeing you then. Bye for now.